The centuries roll backward. The stones remember what the world has forgotten. Here, where red columns taper downward toward polished gypsum floors, where corridors twist and branch like the passages of a living mind, a civilization breathes again. The faint scent of saffron and olive oil seems to linger in the warm Aegean air. Frescoes of dolphins arc across plastered walls. Somewhere beyond these palace courts, the sea stretches toward Egypt, toward the coasts of Anatolia, toward a network of trade routes that once bound the ancient world together. This is the story of two civilizations that built everything we call Greece. Long before the Parthenon rose above Athens, long before philosophers debated in marble colonnades, two extraordinary cultures emerged from these rocky shores and fertile valleys and laid every foundation upon which the classical world would stand. The first arose here on Crete, around 5,000 years ago, when a people we now call the Minoans constructed labyrinthine palaces at Knossos, Paistos, and Malea, invented writing systems still not fully deciphered, and commanded the seas with a confidence so absolute their cities needed no defensive walls. The second emerged on the Greek mainland, in citadels of Cyclopean stone, where warriors wearing boar tusk helmets buried their kings beneath golden death masks and forged the earliest written form of the Greek language. Together, these two cultures created the gods who would reign on Olympus. Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, Dionysus, all their names appear on clay tablets baked hard by the very fires that destroyed the palaces. Together, they shaped the myths that Homer would sing centuries later, the architectural forms that Greek temples would echo, the maritime identity that defined Hellenic civilization for millennia. From the first Neolithic farmers who crossed the sea to settle Crete around 7,000 years before the Common Era, through the rise of the great palaces, the catastrophic eruption that buried an entire city under volcanic ash on the island of Thera, the golden age of Mycenaean power when citadels dominated the Aegean and diplomats exchanged letters with Hittite kings, to the mysterious collapse that silenced this world for 400 years. This is the complete journey. Every chapter of this story will unfold in its proper order. The rise of palace civilization, the peak of Minoan artistry when bull lepers soared across painted walls, the warrior graves overflowing with gold, the conquest of Crete, the monumental Lion Gate and the treasury of Atreus with its dome unsurpassed for over 1,000 years, the economy of bread, oil, and wine, the rituals offered to gods whose names survived the darkness, and then the burning of the palaces, the long silence, and the slow rebirth that carried Bronze Age memory into the classical world we recognize today. This is not simply a history lesson. This is a civilization revealed in its entirety, from the first stone tools to the moment in 1952 when a young architect named Michael Ventris decoded the script on those fire-baked tablets and proved that the Mycenaeans spoke Greek, connecting the Bronze Age directly to everything that followed. The language spoken in these halls became the language of Plato. The gods worshipped in these sanctuaries became the gods of the Parthenon. The myths born in these palaces became the literature of Western civilization. What begins here, among these tapered columns and painted corridors, never truly ended. It transformed, it endured, it became the world we inherited. If complete journeys through ancient civilizations speak to something deep within, consider subscribing so that no chapter of these lost worlds passes unheard. Each week brings the full story of another vanished age, told from the ground where it happened. Now let us begin. The Aegean wind carries us backward through the millennia to an island where the story of Europe itself takes its first breath. The Aegean lies still in the pale light before dawn. A vast expanse of water stretches between three continents, and at its center, rising from the deep like the spine of some slumbering creature, an island breaks the surface. Crete. 160 miles long, narrow, mountainous, its peaks capped with snow, even as wild herbs perfume the lowland air. To the south, across open water, the coast of North Africa shimmers in heat. To the east, the ancient lands of Anatolia and the Levant. To the northwest, the scattered islands and peninsulas of a world that does not yet have a name. Sometime around 7,000 years before the Common Era, the first human settlers arrive. They come from the east, from the coasts of Anatolia, crossing channels of open sea in simple watercraft, reed boats, perhaps, or dugout canoes laden with seed grain and bleating livestock. They carry emmer wheat and barley. They bring sheep and goats, cattle and pigs. These are not wanderers, they are farmers, and they have chosen this island deliberately. At Knossos, on a low mound beside a stream in the northern lowlands, they build their first dwellings. Mud brick walls rise on stone foundations. Floors are packed earth, smoothed and sometimes plastered. The rooms are small, close, functional. Hearths blacken the corners. Storage pits hold grain through the wet winters. Generation after generation, these structures collapse, are leveled, and are built upon again. Over millennia, the settlement mound grows. Archaeological excavation reveals nearly 7 meters of Neolithic deposit beneath the later palace. Layer upon layer of human habitation accumulating like pages in an unwritten book. The pottery of these earliest centuries is handmade, shaped without a wheel, burnished to a dark sheen with smooth stone. Some vessels carry simple incised decoration, lines, chevrons, dots pressed into wet clay. The forms are practical, cooking pots, storage jars, shallow bowls. Yet even in this simplicity there is intention, a care for surface and shape that speaks to something beyond mere utility. Stone tools dominate daily life. Axes of polished greenstone fell timber and clear land, blades of obsidian, volcanic glass, razor-sharp and black as night, slice grain and scrape hides. This obsidian does not come from Crete. It comes from the island of Melos, 120 kilometers to the north across open sea. Its presence in the earliest Neolithic levels at Knossos is proof that even these first settlers maintained maritime connections, navigating by stars and current to obtain a material they could not find at home. Farther south, the broad Masara plain opens between mountain ranges, the richest agricultural land on the island. Settlements take root here too, near what will one day become the Palace of Knossos. The soil is deep and dark. Rainfall gathers in the surrounding hills and feeds the plain through the growing season. Wheat and barley flourish. Olive trees, though not yet cultivated on the scale of later millennia, grow wild in the foothills. For nearly 4,000 years, this world changes with extraordinary slowness. Villages grow but remain modest. Mud brick houses gain additional rooms. Pottery styles shift gradually. New shapes appear, new decorative patterns emerge, firing techniques improve. Copper begins to appear in the final Neolithic centuries, small objects hammered from native metal, hinting at the transformation to come. But there are no palaces, no written records, no monumental architecture. Only the quiet, persistent rhythm of planting and harvest, birth and burial, the slow deepening of roots into island soil. Yet everything that follows, the labyrinthine palaces, the painted frescoes, the ships that will command an empire of water, begins here, in these mud-brick rooms, with these calloused hands pressing grain into dark Cretan earth. Around 3000 before the Common Era, the island begins to stir. The Neolithic stillness that held Crete for 4 millennia gives way to something restless, something new. Settlements that once huddled around a few mud-brick rooms now spread outward, their footprints widening across coastal plains and sheltered valleys. Walls grow thicker, storage rooms multiply, the population swells, and with it, the first unmistakable signs of social complexity emerge from the rocky soil. The transformation arrives partly by sea. Copper, that soft reddish metal, reaches Cretan shores from the mines of Cyprus, carried across open water by traders navigating routes that will only grow busier with each passing century. Cretan smiths learn to heat and hammer it, then to alloy it with tin to produce bronze, harder, sharper, more durable. Bronze daggers replace stone blades, bronze awls and chisels reshape woodworking and construction. The material world accelerates. Tools that once took hours to knap from obsidian can now be cast in molds, replicated, refined. A new economy of metal begins to layer itself over the old economy of grain and herd. At Vasiliki, in the eastern foothills, potters develop a technique that produces something startling. Clay vessels fired unevenly in open kilns emerge with surfaces mottled in deep red and glossy black, the colors swirling together like flame shadows on stone. This Vasiliki ware, distinctive and immediately recognizable, marks a leap in ceramic ambition, pottery as aesthetic statement, not merely function. Farther south, across the broad Messara plain, communities begin burying their dead in circular stone structures, tholos tombs with corbelled walls and low doorways facing east. These communal ossuaries, in use from roughly 2600 before the Common Era onward, hold the bones of dozens, sometimes hundreds of individuals accumulated over generations. But not all burials are equal. Some bodies rest with gold diadems, carved seal stones bearing spirals and geometric patterns, bronze daggers with silver rivets. Others lie bare. Hierarchy has arrived on Crete, written not in script, but in grave goods. On the northern coast, the tiny island of Mochlos, barely a stone's throw from the mainland shore, shelters a harbour settlement of remarkable sophistication. Its tombs yield gold jewellery of astonishing delicacy. Thin bands of hammered gold shaped into diadems, leaf-shaped pendants, chains of interlocking loops. These are not the ornaments of simple farmers. They belong to families who control trade, who broker the exchange of Cypriot copper and Cycladic obsidian and Egyptian faience that increasingly flows through Cretan ports. Seal stones appear in growing numbers across the island, small enough to press into wet clay, their faces carved with abstract motifs, concentric circles, cross-hatching, stylized animals. They serve as markers of identity and authority, personal signatures in a world that does not yet possess writing. Each impression left on a clay ceiling declares ownership, authenticates a transaction, asserts a claim. Administration is being born in miniature. The settlements of this era remain unwalled. No great fortifications ring these growing towns. The sea itself serves as barrier and highway simultaneously, and Crete's position, equidistant from the Peloponnese, the coast of Anatolia, and the shores of North Africa, makes it a natural crossroads. Goods and ideas flow inward from every direction. Egyptian stone vessels appear in Cretan tombs. Cycladic marble figurines surface alongside local pottery. The island absorbs, adapts, synthesizes. By 2100 before the Common Era, nearly a millennium of steady accumulation has reshaped Cretan society beyond recognition. Towns like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea have grown dense and prosperous. Metalworkers, potters, seal carvers, and jewelers form specialized classes. Communal tombs in the Messara testify to lineages that track their status across generations. Maritime networks connect Crete to the wider eastern Mediterranean in a web of mutual dependency. The island stands at a threshold. Everything needed for the next leap: concentrated population, surplus wealth, administrative tools, long-distance trade, social stratification is now in place. The mud-brick villages of the Neolithic have become something far more complex, far more ambitious, and the ground beneath them is about to bear the weight of structures unlike anything Europe has ever seen. Sometime around 1900 before the Common Era, the transformation arrives not gradually, but with astonishing speed. Across the island of Crete, in 4 separate locations, monumental structures rise from the earth on a scale that has no precedent anywhere in Europe. At Knossos in the north, at Phaistos in the south overlooking the broad Messara plain, at Malea along the northeastern coast, and at Petrus near the eastern shore, communities that have spent centuries accumulating wealth and refining craft now channel that energy into something entirely new. Vast architectural complexes organized around great open courtyards, with storage magazines, workshops, ritual spaces, and administrative quarters all gathered under interconnected roof lines. The palace at Phaistos commands one of the most striking positions in the ancient world. It sits on a low hill gazing south across the Messara toward the Asterousia Mountains, its central court aligned roughly north to south, its western facade presenting a stepped theatrical area where hundreds could gather. Massive walls of dressed stone and mud brick define corridors that branch into storerooms packed with ceramic vessels holding oil, grain, and wine. The surplus of an entire region flows inward, is recorded, redistributed, and transformed into political authority. At Malea, the palace spreads across flatter ground near the sea. A Kernos stone, a circular offering table with small hollows carved around its rim, sits in the southern wing, evidence of ritual activity woven directly into the administrative fabric. Nearby, in the Chrysolakos burial complex, goldsmiths produce work of breathtaking delicacy. The Malea pendant, depicting 2 bees or wasps pressing a drop of honey into a granulated gold disc, measures barely 5 centimeters across, yet displays a mastery of filigree and granulation that rivals anything produced in the ancient Near East. With the palaces comes writing. Cretan hieroglyphic script appears on clay bars, seal stones, and ceramic vessels, a system of pictographic and abstract signs used to track commodities and transactions. This is not literature. It is accounting, the language of centralized power managing resources at a scale that demands permanent records. The signs depict axes, arrows, eyes, ships, and animals, pressed into soft clay with carved stamps or incised with a stylus. And then there is the Phaistos disc, a fired clay disc roughly 16 centimeters in diameter, stamped on both sides with 242 impressions arranged in a spiral pattern. 45 distinct signs pressed into the clay with individual punches, the earliest known use of movable type in human history. Its language remains undeciphered. Its purpose is unknown. It sits alone, without parallel, a sealed message from a world that chose not to explain itself. The pottery of this era reaches heights that later periods struggle to match. Kamares ware, named for the cave sanctuary on Mount Ida, where it was first discovered, blazes with white, crimson, orange, and yellow designs painted over a glossy black surface. Spirals, petals, fish, and abstract curves swirl across eggshell-thin vessel walls with a confidence that borders on exuberance. These are not utilitarian objects. They are declarations of aesthetic mastery, traded across the eastern Mediterranean and found as far as Egypt and the Levantine coast. For roughly 2 centuries, this proto-palatial world flourishes. The palaces function simultaneously as economic hubs, religious centers, and seats of political power, a fusion of roles that distinguishes Minoan civilization from its contemporaries. There are no massive fortification walls. There are no monumental sculptures of warrior kings. Authority here expresses itself through architecture, through the control of goods, through ritual performance in open courtyards where the community witnesses and participates. Then, around 1700 before the Common Era, the earth moves. Crete sits atop one of the most seismically active zones in the Mediterranean, and a series of devastating earthquakes brings the first palaces down. At Phaistos, Malea, and Knossos, walls crack, roofs collapse, and storerooms spill their contents across shattered floors. The destruction is comprehensive and undeniable in the archaeological record, thick layers of rubble and ash marking the end of an entire architectural generation. But the Minoans do not abandon their vision. They clear the debris, they level the ruins, and on the same foundations, in the same locations, they begin to build again, larger, more elaborate, more ambitious than before. What rises from the rubble surpasses everything that came before. The Neopalatial period, beginning around 1700 before the Common Era, represents not merely reconstruction but reinvention. The Minoans take the architectural principles of their first palaces and amplify them into something unprecedented in the ancient world. Sprawling complexes of such intricacy that later Greeks will remember them as labyrinths. Knossos leads the transformation. The rebuilt palace spreads across approximately 13,000 square meters, making it the largest Bronze Age structure in all of Europe. Its plan defies simple geometry. Hundreds of rooms cluster around a vast central court, measuring 52 meters long and 28 meters wide, oriented precisely north to south. This open rectangle of packed earth and flagstone serves as the heart of the entire complex, a space for ceremony, assembly, and ritual performance flooded with Cretan sunlight. From the court, corridors branch in every direction. Gypsum slabs, quarried from the island's own geology, pave the floors with a luminous white surface that catches and softens the light. The walls rise in timber-framed masonry, plastered smooth and painted in deep reds, ochres, and blues. Wooden columns, distinctively tapered, wider at the top than at the base, and painted a rich crimson, support the upper stories. These inverted columns become the signature of Minoan architecture, appearing nowhere else in the Bronze Age world. The grand staircase on the eastern side of the palace descends through multiple stories, supported by light wells that channel daylight deep into the interior. These vertical shafts of open air solve an engineering problem with elegance, illuminating rooms that would otherwise sit in permanent shadow. The effect is a building that breathes, that shifts between enclosed intimacy and sudden openness. Lustral basins, small sunken rooms lined with cut gypsum, reached by descending a short flight of steps, appear throughout the palace. Their precise function remains debated, but their careful construction and prominent placement suggest ritual purification or ceremonial use. In the throne room, the oldest throne room in Europe, a carved gypsum seat flanks a lustral basin. Griffin frescoes painted in profile guard the walls, their feathered bodies rendered in flowing lines against a landscape of reeds and undulating terrain. Across the island, other palaces rise with similar ambition. Phaistos is rebuilt on its commanding ridge above the Messara plain. Malea expands around its own central court. And on the far eastern coast, at the harbour site of Zakros, an entirely new palace complex emerges. Zakros faces the open sea toward Egypt and the Levant, positioned as a gateway for eastern trade. Its storerooms will yield elephant tusks, copper ingots, and raw materials from distant shores. The administrative system evolves alongside the architecture. Cretan hieroglyphic, the older script of the first palaces, gradually yields to a new writing system, Linear A, incised into clay tablets, scratched onto vessels, and pressed into nodules that seal containers and doors. Linear A becomes the bureaucratic language of the Neopalatial world. Over 1,400 documents in this script have been recovered from sites across Crete and beyond. The script records inventories, offerings, and transactions, though its language remains undeciphered, its symbols resistant to every attempt at translation. The palaces function as more than royal residences. They are administrative centers, religious sanctuaries, storage facilities, and workshops combined into single architectural organisms. Vast magazines line the western wings, their corridors flanked by enormous clay storage jars, pithoi, standing as tall as a person, their surfaces decorated with rope patterns pressed into wet clay. These rooms hold olive oil, grain, wine, and honey in quantities that suggest centralized collection and redistribution across entire regions. The complexity is staggering. Drainage systems channel rainwater through terracotta pipes fitted together with tapered joints. Ventilation corridors regulate airflow. Polythera, rows of double doors between pier and door partitions, allow rooms to be opened wide or closed off according to season and occasion. Every element reveals a civilization thinking systematically about space, light, storage, and ceremony, building not for display alone, but for the functioning of an entire society organized around the palace as its axis. Beyond the palace walls, beyond the harbors of northern Crete, the sea itself becomes the instrument of power. Between 1700 and 1500 before the Common Era, Minoan civilization extends its reach across the entire Aegean basin, transforming from an island culture into a maritime network of astonishing scope. The ships that depart from Knossos, Phaistos, and the smaller ports along the northern coast carry more than goods. They carry architecture, ritual, script, and a way of organizing the world. The evidence surfaces at Akrotiri on the island of Thera, where a painted frieze stretches across the upper walls of a room in a prosperous house. Known as the miniature frieze, It depicts a naval flotilla in extraordinary detail. Long-hulled vessels with raised prows adorned with painted figureheads, paddlers seated in rows, passengers sheltered beneath canopies of animal hide. The ships move between coastal towns rendered with careful attention to landscape, architecture, and human activity. This is not myth. This is a portrait of Aegean maritime life as it existed, painted by someone who had witnessed these voyages firsthand. Across the Cycladic islands, settlements begin to mirror Cretan models. At Philokopi on Melos, Minoan-style frescoes appear on plastered walls. At Aya Irene on Kea, a temple houses terracotta figures echoing Cretan religious forms. On Rhodes, the coastal settlement of Trianda yields Minoan pottery in such quantities that it functions as an outpost of Cretan culture, a node in a web of exchange linking the eastern Aegean to the palace storerooms of Crete. At Miletus on the Anatolian coast, Minoan material culture appears alongside local traditions, suggesting not conquest, but sustained commercial presence. The roots extend far beyond the Aegean. At Tel el-Daba in the Egyptian Nile Delta, the Hyksos capital of Avaris, fragments of Minoan-style wall paintings have been recovered, depicting bull-leaping scenes rendered in true fresco technique. Cretan pottery appears in Egyptian contexts spanning centuries. The relationship is reciprocal. Egyptian stone vessels, scarabs, and faience objects travel back to Crete, appearing in palace storerooms and elite tombs. The most vivid testimony comes from Egyptian tomb paintings at Thebes. In the tomb of Rechmer, a vizier who served under pharaohs of the 18th dynasty around 1450 before the Common Era, a procession of figures identified by hieroglyphic inscription as Keftiu, people of Crete, approaches bearing gifts. They carry elaborate metal vessels, textiles, and objects of worked ivory. Their clothing is distinctive, kilts with patterned borders, their skin painted reddish-brown in Egyptian artistic convention. These are not captives. They are emissaries, participants in a diplomatic world that stretches from the Nile to the mountains of central Crete. The harbours that sustain this network leave their own traces. At Komos on the southern coast of Crete, facing directly toward Libya and Egypt, excavations reveal ship sheds, long, narrow, stone-built structures designed to shelter vessels hauled ashore. Ashlar masonry lines the foundations. Imported pottery from Egypt, the Levant, and Cyprus fills the surrounding deposits. Komos functions as a gateway port, the point where African and Near Eastern trade goods enter the Cretan system before redistribution through the palace networks. What emerges is not an empire held by military force. No fortification walls ring the Minoan settlements abroad. No weapons caches mark their presence. Instead, this is a thalassocracy sustained by commercial advantage, cultural prestige, and navigational mastery. The Minoans understand the seasonal winds of the Aegean, the currents that flow between the Cyclades, the sheltered anchorages along the Anatolian coast. Their ships carry Kamares ware pottery, bronze tools, woven textiles, and perfumed oils outward, returning with copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, gold from Egypt, ivory from Syria. Every exchange reinforces the centrality of Crete, and every colony or trading post extends the reach of a civilization whose true walls are not stone, but water. 110 kilometers north of Crete, a crescent-shaped island rises from the Aegean. In the 17th century before the Common Era, it is not yet a crescent. It is round, volcanic, its slopes terraced with agriculture, its southern tip crowned by a prosperous town that looks out across a sheltered bay. The island is Thera, the town is Akrotiri, and it is about to vanish. But before the catastrophe, there is life, abundant, refined, unmistakably Minoan in character, yet possessing its own local vitality. Akrotiri is a settlement of 2- and 3-story buildings lining paved streets, their walls constructed of rubble stone, reinforced with timber frames designed to flex during earthquakes. Inside these structures, clay pipes carry fresh water to upper floors. Drains run beneath the streets, channeling waste away from living quarters. The sophistication of the plumbing rivals anything in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The walls themselves are canvases. In one building, the spring fresco unfolds across 3 walls, a volcanic landscape rendered in undulating bands of color, red lilies erupting from rocky outcrops, swallows darting and diving in pairs, their forked tails tracing arcs against a sky of pale cream. In another room, 2 young boys face each other with fists raised, wearing a single boxing glove each, their heads shaved except for long dark locks, their skin rendered in the warm ochre of Minoan convention. Elsewhere, the flotilla fresco stretches across an entire wall, depicting a naval procession of elaborately decorated ships sailing between 2 coastal towns, dolphins leaping alongside the hulls, passengers seated beneath canopies. These are not mere decorations. They are records of ceremony, identity, and belief, painted with mineral pigments directly onto wet plaster. Storage jars stand in rows in ground floor rooms, still containing traces of barley, lentils, and olive oil. Imported Minoan pottery sits alongside local wares. Stone tools, bronze vessels, loom weights, and grinding stones fill domestic spaces. Akrotiri is a thriving node in the Minoan maritime network, a way station between Crete and the northern Aegean. Then the earth begins to shake. Seismic tremors, perhaps weeks or months of warning, drive the inhabitants to flee. They take their valuables. They take their families. No human remains have been found beneath the ash, a silence that speaks of successful evacuation, of a population that understood the mountain's language. What follows is one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. Around 1628 before the Common Era, as dated by radiocarbon analysis and Greenland ice core evidence, Thera detonates. The eruption ejects approximately 60 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. A column of pumice and ash rises tens of kilometers into the sky. Pyroclastic surges race across the island's surface. The magma chamber beneath the volcano empties and collapses, and the sea rushes in to fill the void. The round island becomes a caldera, the crescent shape that defines modern Santorini. Akrotiri disappears beneath meters of pumice and volcanic tephra. The ash seals the town in a state of suspended time. Frescoes retain their pigment. Pottery remains unbroken on shelves. Wooden furniture leaves perfect casts in the hardened debris. The preservation is extraordinary, rivaling Pompeii, yet predating it by more than 16 centuries. The eruption's effects radiate outward. Ash falls across the eastern Mediterranean. Tsunami waves generated by the caldera collapse strike the northern coast of Crete. The precise impact on Minoan civilization remains a matter of careful scholarly debate, but the scale of the event is beyond question. Trade routes are disrupted. Agricultural land on nearby islands is buried. The psychological shock of witnessing such destruction reverberates through a culture intimately connected to the sea and the islands it sustains. Thera, once a jewel in the Minoan maritime world, becomes a tomb of ash, silent, sealed, waiting beneath the earth for 35 centuries until archaeologists begin to uncover what the volcano preserved. Crete endures. In the decades following the cataclysm to the north, the island's palatial centers do not collapse, but instead enter their most luminous age. The 16th and 15th centuries before the Common Era witness a civilization that, though shaken, pours its energy into creation with an intensity that borders on defiance. The palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros hum with activity. Workshops produce pottery of refined elegance, storerooms fill with oil and grain. And on the walls of the great palace at Knossos, artists apply pigment to wet plaster with a confidence and vitality unmatched anywhere in the Bronze Age world. The Bull Leaper fresco captures a moment of impossible grace. Against a pale blue background, a massive bull charges forward, its body stretched in full gallop. 3 figures interact with the animal, one grasping the horns, one vaulting over the arched back in mid-flight, one landing behind with arms raised. The musculature of the bull is rendered with anatomical precision, its hide dappled in brown and white. Whether this scene records an actual ritual or an idealized ceremony, it speaks to a culture that placed the bull at the sacred center of its world. Nearby, the Prince of the Lilies relief emerges from the plaster in painted stucco, a figure striding forward wearing a crown of lilies and peacock feathers, a necklace of fleur-de-lis at the throat. The posture is upright, elegant, processional. The Saffron Gatherer fresco, originally misidentified as a boy picking flowers, reveals upon closer study a blue monkey harvesting crocus stamens, connecting the image to the precious spice trade that links Crete to the wider Mediterranean. In shrine rooms and domestic sanctuaries, the faience snake goddess figurines stand with arms extended, serpents coiling around their wrists and waists. Their bare breasts and tiered, flounced skirts embody a female divine authority that pervades Minoan religion. These are not decorative objects. They are expressions of a theology in which feminine power governs the sacred landscape. The caves, the mountain peaks, the pillar crypts beneath the palaces. Yet beneath this brilliance, vulnerability grows. The trade networks that once stretched seamlessly across the Aegean have been strained by the Theran disaster. Settlements on islands closest to the eruption have been abandoned or diminished. On the Greek mainland, a warrior culture is growing stronger, its shaft graves filling with gold and bronze, its chieftains watching the sea lanes with increasing ambition. Around 1450 before the Common Era, catastrophe strikes with devastating precision. Fire sweeps through the palace at Zakros on the eastern coast. Destruction layers of ash and collapsed masonry seal rooms still filled with unfinished goods, raw materials for bronze work, storage vessels of olive oil, ritual objects left in place as though the end came suddenly. At Malea, the same pattern emerges. At Phaistos, the great palace overlooking the Mazara plain burns and is never rebuilt. Across Crete, every major palatial center is destroyed within a narrow window of time. Every center except one. Knossos alone survives. But the Knossos that continues into the following decades is not the same. The administrative records shift from Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoans, to Linear B, a writing system that will be proven, millennia later, to record an early form of Greek. New pottery styles appear. Military iconography increases. The warrior grave at Knossos yields bronze weapons and a helmet of boar's tusks, artifacts far more consistent with mainland Mycenaean culture than with Minoan tradition. The evidence points toward conquest. A new ruling class, Greek-speaking and martial in character, has taken control of the greatest palace on Crete. The administrative apparatus remains. The storerooms, the scribes, the redistribution networks, but the hands directing it have changed. The civilization that built the labyrinth, that leaped over bulls, that painted dolphins on palace walls, has reached its twilight. Its artistic legacy will endure for millennia. Its religious symbols will echo through Greek culture. But the palaces that gave it form, save for occupied Knossos, lie in ruins across the island, their frescoes cracking in the heat of fires set by hands that came from across the sea. The story now crosses the sea. While Crete's palaces rise and fall across centuries of splendor, a different world takes shape on the Greek mainland, separated by barely 100 kilometers of open water, yet defined by an entirely distinct temperament. The Argolid plain opens beneath a sky of hard blue, ringed by limestone mountains scarred white in the summer heat. Dry riverbeds cut through terrain that yields barley and olive, but demands labor for every harvest. This is not the lush abundance of Crete. This is a landscape that breeds endurance. At the northeastern edge of the plain, a rocky acropolis rises between two ravines. It commands views across the entire valley to the sea at Nauplion. Long before any Cyclopean wall crowns its summit, long before any lion guards its gate, this hill attracts settlement. By 1700 before the Common Era, a community of Greek-speaking people inhabits the slopes of what will become Mycenae. They are descendants of populations who migrated into the peninsula centuries earlier, Indo-European speakers whose language will one day become the tongue of Homer and Plato. But in these early generations they are modest, herders, farmers, local chieftains whose power extends no further than the neighboring hills. Then something shifts. Around 1650 before the Common Era, burials begin appearing on the western slope of the Acropolis that reveal a sudden, dramatic concentration of wealth and martial authority. A circular enclosure approximately 25 meters in diameter, later designated Grave Circle B, contains 26 burials in rock-cut shaft graves and simple cists. The bodies lie with bronze swords, long daggers, clay and stone vessels, and ornaments of gold. One burial includes a rock crystal bowl shaped like a duck, its craftsmanship suggesting contact with Minoan artisans or their traditions. Gold diadems press against skulls. Bronze blades bear traces of use. These are warriors. The swords are not ceremonial. They are functional weapons, long-bladed and balanced for thrusting combat. The daggers show gold inlay work depicting spirals and running animals, techniques that echo Cretan metalworking yet serve a distinctly martial purpose. Boar tusks appear among the grave goods, destined to be sewn onto leather helmets in a fashion unique to the mainland. The dead are buried with their weapons because identity and status are inseparable from the capacity for violence. The wealth accumulating in these graves does not emerge from local agriculture alone. Trade connections are forming. Amber beads originating from the distant Baltic reach the Argolid through exchange networks spanning the breadth of Europe. Minoan pottery appears in mainland contexts, and mainland imitations of Cretan forms begin circulating. The elite of early Mycenae are absorbing Cretan artistic vocabulary, the spirals, the marine motifs, the taste for gold, while retaining their own cultural grammar of warfare and hierarchical display. Yet no palace stands here. No grand staircase descends through light wells. No frescoes of dolphins adorn the walls. The architecture remains modest compared to Knossos or Phaistos. Power at Mycenae in this period is personal, concentrated in the bodies of individual leaders and expressed through what accompanies them into the earth. The shaft grave is not merely a tomb, but a statement, a vertical descent into bedrock, sealed with stone slabs and marked by carved stelae above ground. Some stelae bear relief carvings of chariots and spirals, the earliest monumental sculpture on the Greek mainland. The chariot itself is new to this world, likely adopted through contact with the eastern Mediterranean. Its presence on grave markers signals not only military technology, but aspiration, a ruling class reaching outward, absorbing innovations, and transforming them into symbols of local authority. Across the Argolid, at Lerna and Asin, and the coastal settlements near Tiryns, similar patterns emerge on a smaller scale. An entire region is crystallizing around competitive elites who measure status in bronze, gold, and the honor of armed burial. The age of the Mycenaean warrior aristocracy has begun, and within a single century, its wealth will surpass anything yet seen on the European mainland. Within a generation, that wealth surpasses itself. By 1550 before the Common Era, a new burial ground opens on the Citadel Hill at Mycenae, closer to the summit than the older graves, more prominent, more deliberately monumental. 6 deep shaft graves are cut into the soft rock, their floors descending 3 to 4 meters below the surface, their walls lined with rubble masonry. Wooden beams span the openings, supporting roofs of slate and clay. Into these chambers, across roughly 50 years, 19 individuals are lowered, men, women, and children of a dynasty whose names are lost, but whose possessions survive in almost hallucinatory abundance. Gold is everywhere. Thin sheets of it are hammered into masks and pressed against the faces of the dead, preserving idealized features in cold metal. 5 such masks emerge from these graves, each unique. One depicts a bearded man with closed eyes and a serene expression. The gold so finely worked that individual eyelashes seem to tremble at the edges. This is the face that will later be called the Mask of Agamemnon, though the man beneath it lived 3 centuries before any possible date for the Trojan War. The mask weighs only 60 grams, yet it carries the weight of an entire civilization's ambition. Beside the bodies lie weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship. Bronze daggers bear inlaid scenes executed in niello, a black metallic alloy set into channels cut in the blade, then filled with gold and silver to create images of astonishing detail. One dagger shows a lion hunt along a river bordered by papyrus plants, a scene unmistakably influenced by Nilotic art, suggesting direct contact with Egypt or its artistic traditions. Another depicts cats stalking waterfowl through marshes. These are not merely weapons, but narrative objects, portable declarations of a warrior elite fluent in international visual language. Gold diadems encircle the skulls of women, their surfaces embossed with circles and rosettes. Gold discs, hundreds of them, once sewn onto shrouds and garments, scatter across the grave floors like fallen coins. Rock crystal bowls, carved from single pieces of translucent stone, rest near bronze vessels. A silver riton shaped like a siege scene shows warriors scaling a fortified city while defenders hurl stones from the walls, one of the earliest narrative compositions in European art. Amber beads, their resin sourced from the distant Baltic coast, prove that trade networks already stretch across thousands of kilometers. Gold balance scales, miniature but functional, suggest commerce or ritual weighing of precious materials. Electrum pins, bronze mirrors, ivory combs, and boar's tusk plates that once armored helmets fill the graves in layers. The total weight of gold recovered from these 6 shafts exceeds 14 kilograms, more than any contemporary burial site in the Mediterranean world. The bodies themselves tell their own story. Several male skeletons show healed fractures and evidence of violent trauma consistent with combat. These are not merely wealthy aristocrats, but fighting men, buried with the swords and spears they wielded. The women's graves contain equal opulence, indicating that status flows through lineage, not gender alone. What makes this burial ground extraordinary is not only its contents, but its concentration. Within a single hilltop, across 2 or 3 generations, a ruling family accumulates and then surrenders to the earth, a treasury that rivals the courts of contemporary Egypt and Mesopotamia. The gold comes from multiple sources, some possibly from Nubia through Egyptian intermediaries, some perhaps from Anatolian deposits. The craftsmanship blends Minoan technique with mainland taste, creating a hybrid aesthetic that is neither purely Cretan nor purely Helladic, but something new. This is the moment when Mycenae declares itself. The shaft graves of this circle are not hidden or modest. They are statements carved into the rock of the citadel itself, visible markers of a dynasty that intends to be remembered. Centuries later, the Mycenaeans who build the Lion Gate will incorporate this ancient burial ground within the expanded walls, enclosing it in a circular parapet of upright stone slabs, honoring ancestors whose individual identities have already faded into reverence. The gold endures beneath the earth, waiting. Around 1450 before the Common Era, fire sweeps through every major palace on Crete except one. Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, Galatas, each burns within the same narrow window of destruction. The archaeological record is unambiguous. Charred beams collapse into storerooms. Fallen masonry seals corridors. Fine pottery shatters across floors that will never be swept again. Whatever force brings this devastation, whether coordinated military assault, opportunistic conquest following natural disaster, or some convergence of both, the result reshapes the entire island. When the smoke clears, Knossos alone stands, and the hands now guiding its administration are not Minoan. The evidence appears in clay. In the archive rooms and storerooms of Knossos, a new script emerges on the tablets. Linear A, the undeciphered writing system that served Minoan bureaucracy for centuries, vanishes from use. In its place, scribes press a related but distinctly different set of syllabic signs into wet clay. The signs share visual ancestry with Linear A, borrowing many of the same forms, but the language they record is something entirely new at Knossos. It is Greek. The script is Linear B, and its presence at Knossos after 1450 before the Common Era marks the clearest proof that Mycenaean Greeks have seized control of the palace. The tablets themselves reveal an administration obsessed with inventory and control. Scribes catalogue chariots, wheels stored separately from frames, tallied with meticulous precision. Wool production records track flocks numbering in the thousands, assigning specific quantities to specific textile workshops. Bronze allocations are noted by weight. Offerings to deities are listed alongside commodity distributions. Over 3,000 Linear B tablets survive from Knossos, preserved only because the fire that eventually destroys the palace around 1375, before the Common Era, bakes the soft clay into permanence. The cultural shift registers in more than writing. The warrior grave, discovered near the palace, contains a bronze sword, a mirror, and vessels of Mycenaean type. Burial goods reflecting mainland martial values rather than Minoan ritual tradition. Pottery styles change. The naturalistic marine motifs and flowing organic forms that defined Minoan ceramic art give way to stiffer, more schematic designs characteristic of Mycenaean workshops. The palace style, a hybrid form produced at Knossos during this transitional period, retains Minoan decorative vocabulary but organizes it with a mainland sense of symmetry and formality. Octopus tentacles that once swirled freely across flask surfaces now arrange themselves in rigid bilateral patterns. The throne room itself may bear witness to this transformation. The alabaster seat flanked by painted griffins, long assumed to be the heart of Minoan sacred kingship, shows signs of modification during the Mycenaean occupation. The room's function possibly shifts from ritual to administrative authority, reflecting a mainland conception of centralized power vested in a single ruler. The Wonax, the title that Linear B tablets assign to the highest authority. Knossos, under Mycenaean control, becomes the administrative capital of the entire island. The palace functions as the hub of a redistributive economy governing agriculture, textile production, military resources, and religious observance across Crete. Satellite sites report to it. Roads connect it to harbors and hinterland settlements. For roughly 75 years, this arrangement endures. A Mycenaean Greek elite governing from a Minoan architectural masterpiece, writing Greek in a script descended from Cretan invention, worshipping gods whose names blend mainland and island traditions. Then, around 1375, before the Common Era, Knossos itself burns. The cause remains uncertain. The destruction is thorough. The great palace that survived every previous catastrophe, earthquakes, the Thera eruption, the wave of destructions that claimed its sister sites, finally falls. Its Linear B archive, baked hard in the conflagration, preserves the last administrative snapshot of a world in transition. The tablets record no panic, no awareness of approaching doom. They document sheep and wheels and jars of honey destined for the gods. The palace collapses into its own foundations, and Crete's age of great palatial centers ends forever. Power has already migrated across the water to the Cyclopean citadels of the mainland, where Mycenaean civilization is entering its most ambitious century. The Argolid plain shimmers under summer heat, and the citadel of Mycenae commands the landscape from its rocky spur between two peaks. In the decades after Knossos falls silent, this fortress transforms. What begins as a hilltop stronghold with modest defenses becomes something unprecedented on the Greek mainland, a monument in stone so massive that its builders seem to challenge permanence itself. The walls rise in the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era. Limestone boulders, some weighing more than 10 tons, are hauled from nearby quarries and fitted together without mortar. The blocks are rough-hewn, their irregular faces interlocking through sheer mass and gravity. Smaller stones fill the gaps between them. The technique is brutal in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. These walls stand 7 to 8 meters high and nearly 6 meters thick in places, enclosing the summit in an irregular circuit that follows the natural contours of the ridge. Centuries later, classical Greeks will stand before these same walls and conclude that no human hands could have placed such stones. Only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, possessed the strength. The name endures. Cyclopean masonry becomes the term for this construction across the archaeological world. Around 1250 before the Common Era, the citadel receives its most iconic feature. A monumental gateway pierces the western wall, framed by 4 massive blocks, 2 jambs, a threshold, and a lintel stone spanning nearly 5 meters. Above the lintel, a relieving triangle of open space bears a carved limestone slab 3.1 meters high. 2 lions stand in heraldic pose, their forepaws resting on twin altars that support a single tapering column. Their heads, once carved separately and attached with dowels, are lost. But the bodies remain, muscular and symmetrical, guardians frozen in permanent vigilance. This is the Lion Gate, the oldest monumental sculpture in Europe, and every person entering Mycenae passes beneath their gaze. 15 kilometers to the south, the citadel of Tiryns occupies a low limestone outcrop rising from the coastal plain. Its walls are even more extraordinary. In places they reach 7.5 meters in thickness, and within that thickness the builders carve corbelled galleries, long, narrow passages roofed by stones, stepping progressively inward until they meet overhead. Light enters from openings along one side, casting angled beams across the rough interior surfaces. These galleries serve as storage, as defensive corridors, as passages connecting different levels of the fortification. The engineering is precise. Each corbelled course bears the weight of the one above, distributing pressure outward through the wall's mass. Northeast of Mycenae, the smaller citadel of Medea crowns a steep hill, its cyclopean walls tracing a circuit around the summit. Its position guards the eastern approaches to the Argolid, part of an integrated defensive network linking the major centers. Far to the north, in the drained basin of Lake Copais in Boeotia, the fortress of Glar presents a different scale entirely. Its circuit wall stretches nearly 3 kilometers, enclosing 235,000 square meters, an area 10 times larger than Mycenae. The interior contains not a single palatial megaron, but rather organized complexes suggesting administrative and military functions. Massive drainage works in the surrounding plain, including canals and dikes controlling the lake's waters, point to a coordinated engineering project of remarkable ambition. These citadels are not merely defensive. They are statements of power carved into the landscape. The labor required to quarry, transport, and place thousands of multi-ton blocks demands centralized authority, capable of commanding hundreds of workers across years of sustained effort. The walls declare dominion over every valley they overlook. The corbelled galleries demonstrate mastery of structural forces. The Lion Gate announces sovereignty through art fused with architecture. Across the Mycenaean world, from the Argolid to Boeotia to Messenia, the 13th century before the Common Era witnesses a civilization building for eternity. The irony is that within a few generations, fire will consume the palaces these walls protect. But the walls themselves will endure, standing through 3,000 years of rain and earthquake, outlasting every structure built within them, waiting in silence for the age that will learn to read their stones. A road cuts through the hillside southwest of the citadel, carved into the living rock and lined on both sides with walls of ashlar conglomerate, each block dressed smooth and fitted with precision. This is the Dromos, the approach corridor, and it stretches 36 meters in length, narrowing the world to a single vanishing point ahead. The walls rise steadily as the path descends, reaching over 6 meters in height where they meet the facade, and the effect is deliberate, a compression of space designed to magnify what waits at the end. There, set into the hillside like a gateway between worlds, stands the largest doorway in the Bronze Age Aegean. The entrance measures 5.5 meters tall. Above it rests a lintel composed of 2 enormous blocks of conglomerate stone, the inner one weighing approximately 120 tons. No crane exists in this age. No iron. The engineering required to quarry, transport, and position such a mass using only bronze tools, timber sledges, earthen ramps, and human coordination represents one of the supreme technical achievements of the 13th century before the Common Era. Above the lintel, a relieving triangle once held decorative stonework, now lost, that likely mirrored the sculptural program of the Lion Gate nearby. Flanking the doorway, engaged half-columns of green marble from Laconia once rose in tapering shafts carved with chevron patterns, their bases and capitals richly ornamented. Fragments recovered during excavation reveal red and green stone inlays that transformed the facade into a polychrome monument visible from the Dromos approach. This was architecture intended to overwhelm. Beyond the threshold, the interior opens into a circular chamber, 14.5 meters in diameter and 13.2 meters high. The dome rises in 33 concentric rings of cut stone, each course projecting slightly inward beyond the one below, the blocks shaped and smoothed on their inner faces to create a continuous curving surface. This is corbelling raised to an art form, not a true arch, but a gravitational miracle nonetheless, the largest unsupported span the world will know until Roman engineers pour concrete into the mold of the Pantheon more than a millennium later. Small holes punctuate the interior walls in regular patterns, the remnants of bronze nails that once secured decorative rosettes across the dome surface, transforming the chamber into a ceiling of metallic stars. To the right of the main chamber, a doorway leads into a smaller rectangular side room cut directly into the bedrock. Its walls are rough, unfinished compared to the precision of the tholos itself, and its purpose remains debated. A secondary burial space, a repository for grave goods, a ritual chamber. Whatever treasures it once held vanished long before modern archaeology arrived. The tomb was opened and looted in antiquity, perhaps as early as the classical period, when local tradition already attributed it to the mythical King Atreus. The construction method reveals itself in the surrounding hillside. The entire dome was built from the ground up inside an open circular pit, the stone rings rising course by course, while an earthen mound was simultaneously heaped around and over the structure to counteract lateral thrust. Only after the final capstone was placed and the earth packed tight could the interior be hollowed out and the Dromos excavated to provide access. The labor involved, quarrying, shaping, hauling, lifting, backfilling, required hundreds of workers sustained over years, a mobilization of resources that only a palace economy commanding surplus grain, bronze, and human labor could achieve. This tomb, built around 1250 before the Common Era, stands as the culmination of a tradition stretching back centuries through smaller tholos tombs scattered across the Peloponnese and Messenia. But none approach its scale, none match its ambition. The treasury of Atreus represents a civilization at the apex of its engineering confidence, channeling monumental effort into honoring the dead, with a structure meant to endure beyond memory itself. The dome holds. The darkness inside remains absolute and cool, untouched by the Argolid sun. The stones press inward with patient, calculated weight, each ring trusting the one below, the whole structure a testament to the understanding that gravity, properly directed, becomes its own mortar. Westward from the Argolid, across the mountainous spine of the Peloponnese, the landscape softens into the rolling hills and olive groves of Messenia. Here, on a ridge called Epano Englianos overlooking the Bay of Navarino, a palace rises that will prove more revealing than any other Mycenaean structure to survive the centuries. The Palace of Nestor at Pylos, built and expanded between 1300 and 1200 before the Common Era, lacks the imposing Cyclopean fortifications of Mycenae or Tiryns. Its walls are rubble and mud brick, plastered smooth and painted in vivid color. No massive defensive circuit guards its perimeter. This is a palace of administration and ceremony, not siege warfare, and its relative vulnerability will paradoxically become its greatest gift to history. The complex sprawls across more than 100 rooms arranged around a central axis. At its heart stands the Megaron, the great hall that defines Mycenaean palatial architecture in its purest form. A porch with a single column leads through a vestibule into the throne room itself, where 4 wooden columns frame a circular hearth at the center, its rim decorated with painted flame patterns. The floor surrounding it bears elaborate painted motifs. An octopus stretches its tentacles across the plaster surface. Geometric borders frame abstract designs in red, blue, yellow, and black. The throne sits against the right wall, positioned so the ruler faces the hearth and the entrance beyond. Smoke rises through an opening in the roof above, and light falls through it in a single shaft that illuminates the painted surfaces with shifting warmth. Beyond the Megaron, corridors lead to storerooms of astonishing abundance. In one pantry alone, excavators recovered approximately 2,800 stemmed drinking cups, kylikes, stacked on shelves, ready for feasting on a scale that speaks to the palace's role as a center of communal ritual and redistribution. Oil storage rooms hold rows of large pithoi and smaller stirrup jars, their contents once perfumed with sage, coriander, and rose for export across the Mediterranean. Adjacent to the main entrance, a small room changes everything known about Mycenaean civilization. On his very first day of excavation in April of 1939, the American archaeologist Carl Blegen uncovers hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with Linear B script, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace and thereby preserved for over 3,000 years. Eventually, more than 1,000 tablets emerge from this archive room, recording in meticulous detail the administrative machinery of a Mycenaean kingdom. Sheep tallied in flocks exceeding 100,000 across the territory. Bronze allocated to individual smiths by name. Textile workers organized by task and location. Land holdings distributed under the authority of the Wanax, the king, and the Lawagetas, the military leader. Most remarkably, the tablets record religious offerings with careful specificity. Grain, honey, perfumed oil, and livestock are designated for Poseidaone, Poseidon, who appears as the chief deity of Pylos, receiving more offerings than any other god in the archive. Other divine names surface: Zeus, Hera, Hermes, and a mysterious figure called the Dove Goddess. The tablets reveal a world where the sacred and the economic are inseparable, where accounting is itself an act of devotion. In the eastern wing, a terracotta bathtub sits in a small chamber beside the queen's quarters, its interior still bearing traces of a painted spiral pattern. Nearby rooms contain cosmetic vessels and personal items suggesting intimate domestic life within the administrative complex. The palace is simultaneously a government center, a religious institution, a warehouse, a workshop, and a home. The ridge at Epano Englianos catches the Messenian wind, carrying the scent of thyme and salt from the bay below. The palace stands open to this landscape, unfortified, trusting in distance and diplomacy rather than stone. That trust will not last. But in the decades of its flourishing, Pylos operates as the most complete expression of Mycenaean palatial civilization. Every transaction recorded, every offering measured, every cup counted and shelved for the next great feast. Beyond the palace walls and the counted cups, beyond the olive groves of Messenia and the Cyclopean ramparts of the Argolid, the Mycenaean world extends across a vast web of diplomatic correspondence, traded goods, and shared prestige that stretches from the central Mediterranean to the banks of the Euphrates. Between 1400 and 1200 before the Common Era, the citadel lords of mainland Greece are not isolated warlords, but recognized players in the interconnected diplomatic system of the Late Bronze Age. In the royal archives at Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, high on the Anatolian plateau, cuneiform tablets preserve the name Ahiyawa. Hittite scribes use it to designate a kingdom across the sea to the west, a power whose influence reaches the Anatolian coastline and whose ruler commands enough authority to intervene in regional disputes. The Tawagalawa letter, composed by a Hittite great king, likely Hattusili III, around 1260 before the Common Era, addresses the king of Ahiyawa with the title Great King, a diplomatic designation reserved exclusively for rulers of equal standing. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria. The Hittite monarch later erases this title from the tablet, perhaps reconsidering the concession, but the original impression remains visible in the clay. Ahiyawa, most scholars now agree, refers to a Mycenaean Greek kingdom, possibly centered at Mycenae or Thebes. Farther south, Egyptian records carry their own echoes. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III at Thebes bears an inscription listing place names from the Aegean, including Mucana, almost certainly Mycenae, and Nauplion and Kithra. The term Danaja appears in Egyptian texts, likely corresponding to the Homeric Danaians. Tomb paintings in the Theban necropolis depict foreign emissaries bearing gifts characteristic of Aegean craftsmanship, their garments and vessels unmistakably Mycenaean in style. The material evidence confirms what the texts suggest. Mycenaean pottery, the distinctive stirrup jars designed for transporting perfumed oil, the elegant kylikes and piriform jars painted with octopuses, birds, and geometric bands appears at over 200 sites across the Mediterranean. At Ugarit on the Syrian coast, Mycenaean vessels fill merchant quarters. On Cyprus, Mycenaean imports are so abundant they eventually give way to local imitation. In southern Italy and Sicily, at sites like Scoglio del Torno and Thapsos, Mycenaean ceramics arrive in quantities suggesting direct and sustained contact. Sardinia yields Mycenaean fragments. The Levantine coast is saturated with them. Off the southern coast of Anatolia near Kash, the seabed preserves the most extraordinary single testimony to this interconnected world. The Uluburun shipwreck, dating to approximately 1300 before the Common Era, carries cargo from at least 9 distinct cultures. 10 tons of Cypriot copper in the form of oxhide ingots lie stacked in the hull alongside a ton of tin, likely from Afghanistan. Canaanite storage jars hold terebinth resin. Ebony logs from Nubia rest beside elephant tusks and hippopotamus teeth. Baltic amber, Egyptian gold scarabs, a Mycenaean sword, Cypriot pottery, and a unique gold chalice share the cargo hold. A small wooden writing tablet, a diptych with ivory hinges, suggests the ship carried administrative records now dissolved by the sea. This single vessel embodies the late Bronze Age system in miniature, a world where raw materials, luxury goods, and diplomatic gifts circulate along maritime routes connecting palatial economies in a chain of mutual dependence. The Mycenaean kingdoms participate not as peripheral recipients, but as active agents, exporting perfumed oil, fine pottery, textiles, and possibly mercenary warriors. Their ships navigate routes from the Argolid to the Nile Delta, from Crete to the harbors of the Levant. The system functions on reciprocity, royal correspondence, and the careful exchange of prestige goods between rulers who address one another as brothers. It is a world of extraordinary sophistication and equally extraordinary fragility, sustained by networks so interdependent that the failure of one link threatens the entire chain. The wealth of the Mycenaean world does not rest on gold alone. It rests on soil, on rain, on the slow ripening of grain under an Aegean sun, and on the meticulous bureaucracy that transforms harvest into power. Behind every cyclopean wall and every diplomatic gift dispatched to foreign courts stands a system of agricultural production so tightly administered that not a single sheep goes uncounted. The terraced hillsides of the Peloponnese and central Greece descend in stepped rows toward valley floors, each terrace retained by dry stone walls that hold thin Mediterranean soil against the pull of winter rains. Wheat and barley grow in the lowland fields around Pylos, Mycenae, and Thebes. Olive groves silver the slopes, their gnarled trunks centuries old by the 13th century before the Common Era. Vineyards climb the warmer exposures, their fruit destined for the wine that accompanies every ritual offering and every palace feast. This is the Mediterranean triad, grain, oil, and wine, and it forms the economic skeleton of palatial civilization. The palace controls everything. At Pylos, Linear B tablets record land holdings divided into 2 categories: Kekemena, communal land, and Kitimena, land held by private individuals under palatial authority. The Wanax, the supreme ruler, holds the largest allotment. Below him, the Lawagetas, the leader of the people, receives the next share. Every plot is measured, every obligation noted. The system is redistributive. The palace collects agricultural surplus, stores it, and allocates it outward to craftsmen, soldiers, priests, and laborers who serve the palatial economy. The storerooms make this visible. Rows of pithoi, massive clay storage jars standing as tall as a person, line the magazines of every major palace. At Pylos, the pantries hold thousands of kylikes alongside oil vessels and grain containers. At Mycenaean Tiryns, similar magazines occupy ground-floor corridors, their contents inventoried on clay tablets with exacting precision. The olive oil economy reaches particular sophistication. Tablets from Pylos document perfumed oil production in remarkable detail, listing the ingredients mixed with rendered olive oil, coriander, rose, sage, and other aromatics. These scented oils serve religious purposes as offerings to the gods, but they also function as luxury trade goods, exported in stirrup jars whose sealed spouts prevent spillage during long sea voyages. The stirrup jar becomes one of the most recognizable Mycenaean exports, found from Sardinia to the Levantine coast. Textile production operates on an industrial scale. Pylos tablets record flocks totaling over 100,000 sheep, their wool carefully tracked from shearing through spinning to finished cloth. Groups of women workers, sometimes numbering 30 or 40 in a single entry, are assigned to specific textile tasks. Flax fields supply linen fiber. The finished textiles, dyed and decorated, represent significant stored wealth. Bronze smithing depends on imported copper and tin, and the tablets track allocations of metal to individual smiths by name. At Pylos, approximately 400 bronze workers receive measured quantities of raw material, and their output is monitored. Nothing escapes the scribal eye. The scribes themselves sit at the center of this system, pressing sharp styli into moist clay tablets, recording inventories using the syllabic signs of linear B alongside ideograms for commodities, a stylized oil jar, a wheat stalk, a sheep. These tablets are never meant to be permanent. They are annual records, recycled each year when new accounts begin. Only catastrophic fire preserves them, baking the soft clay into permanence. The entire system depends on centralized authority. The Wanax presides over a hierarchy of officials, collectors who gather tribute from outlying districts, local governors who administer provincial towns, and religious functionaries who ensure that the gods receive their measured portions of grain, oil, honey, and livestock. Every district owes specific contributions. Every contribution is recorded. It is an economy of astonishing administrative ambition, one that feeds armies, equips fleets, supplies artisans, and sustains a ruling class whose power derives not from conquest alone, but from the careful management of the land's abundance. The terraces hold the soil, the scribes hold the records, and the palace holds everything together, a single organizing intelligence governing the flow of bread, oil, and wine across an interconnected world that has not yet learned how fragile such systems can be. Behind the administrative records and the counted jars of oil, behind the tallied flocks and the measured grain, another world thrives within the palace economy, a world of fire, hammer, and exacting skill. The artisans of the Mycenaean and late Minoan world are not anonymous laborers. At Pylos, linear B tablets name them individually, recording approximately 400 bronze smiths distributed across the kingdom, each allocated specific quantities of raw metal. These are specialists whose craft sustains the machinery of palace civilization, and their work survives in objects of breathtaking precision. A tomb near the Laconian village of Vapheo yields 2 gold cups dating to roughly 1500 before the Common Era. Each is fashioned in repoussé, the gold sheet worked from behind with careful hammer blows to raise figures in relief. One cup depicts a wild bull entangled in nets, its body twisting with violent energy, muscles rippling beneath the gold surface. The other shows a tame bull standing calmly in a pastoral landscape. The contrast is deliberate, the craftsmanship supreme. Every sinew of the struggling animal, every fold of the net, emerges from a single sheet of gold no thicker than a fingernail. At Dendra, near ancient Medea in the Argolid, a chamber tomb surrenders the oldest complete suit of bronze armor in Europe, dating to approximately 1400 before the Common Era. The panoply consists of a cuirass of hammered bronze plates protecting the torso, shoulder guards, arm guards, and a collar piece, all fitted together with leather thongs. It weighs nearly 15 kilograms. This is not ceremonial display. This is functional battlefield protection, shaped to the human body with an understanding of both metallurgy and anatomy. Ivory carvers work with equal mastery. At Mycenae, a group of figurines carved from hippopotamus ivory depicts two women and a child, their garments rendered in meticulous detail, their bodies intertwined in a composition of tenderness and ritual significance. The ivory arrives from Egypt and the Levant through the same trade networks that carry copper from Cyprus and tin from distant sources in the West or Central Asia. Each carved piece represents not only artistic skill, but the reach of an entire commercial world. Seal stones demand perhaps the most astonishing precision. Craftsmen engrave scenes onto surfaces smaller than a thumbnail, lions attacking deer, griffins in flight, ritual processions using tools of bronze or hard stone points. The detail visible only under magnification suggests the use of some form of lens or water drop magnifier, though no definitive evidence survives. These miniature masterworks serve as personal identifiers, pressed into clay to seal documents and storeroom doors. Pottery evolves across these centuries from Minoan origins into distinctly Mycenaean forms. The marine style, born on Crete with its octopuses, argonauts, and seaweed, rendered in fluid dark paint on light clay, crosses to the mainland and transforms. Mycenaean potters adopt the octopus motif, but gradually stylize it, stretching tentacles into geometric patterns, imposing symmetry where Minoan artists embraced organic movement. The stirrup jar, a closed vessel with a false spout on top and a true pouring spout to the side, becomes the signature Mycenaean export container, carrying perfumed oil across the Mediterranean. These jars appear at Ugarit, at sites along the Levantine coast, in Cyprus, in Sardinia, in southern Italy. The workshops cluster near the palaces, but also operate in smaller towns and rural centres. Potters, bronze smiths, ivory carvers, goldsmiths, and lapidaries form a specialized class whose labor the palace both depends upon and controls. Raw materials flow inward through administrative channels. Finished goods flow outward as trade commodities, diplomatic gifts, and ritual offerings. The artisan stands at the intersection of economy and art, transforming imported copper and tin into weapons, imported ivory into sacred figurines, imported gold into objects that will outlast the civilization that made them by 3,000 years. High on the ridge of Mount Juctus, south of Knossos, the wind carries the scent of time across a terrace of rough stone. Clay figurines stand upright in the open air, human limbs, animal forms, miniature vessels, left as offerings on the bare rock. No temple walls enclose this space. No roof shelters the worshippers. The peak sanctuary sits exposed to sky and storm, a place where the sacred and the elemental meet without mediation. Across Crete, Dozens of such sanctuaries crown the mountains during the Neopalatial period, each one a point of contact between the human world below and the divine world above. The deity who presides over this landscape is female. She appears on gold signet rings flanked by lions, seated beneath a sacred tree, receiving offerings from smaller attendant figures. She appears as the faience snake goddess from the temple repositories at Knossos, bare-breasted, arms extended, serpents coiling around her wrists, a tiered flounced skirt falling to her feet. Whether she represents one goddess or many aspects of a single divine force remains uncertain, but her dominance in Minoan religious imagery is absolute. Male deities appear rarely and subordinately. The sacred caves, Psychro on the Lasithi Plateau, Kamares on Mount Ida, receive bronze figurines, double axes, and libation vessels deposited over centuries, their dark interiors serving as thresholds to a chthonic realm. On the mainland, religion wears a different face. The Mycenaean cult center at Mycenae, nestled against the citadel's western wall, contains rooms with painted plaster goddess figures, nearly life-sized, their arms raised, their faces solemn. At Tiryns, a similar shrine operates within the fortification walls. These are not open-air sanctuaries on wind-swept peaks, but enclosed palace-adjacent spaces where ritual serves the administrative order. Yet the most extraordinary revelation comes not from architecture, but from clay. The Linear B tablets at Pylos and Knossos, those administrative records of a palace economy, contain divine names that would remain recognizable 1,000 years later in the temples of classical Greece. The syllabic signs spell out Poseidao, Poseidon. They spell Diwo, Zeus. They name Ira, Hera. They record Ari, Ares. They invoke Atana Potinija, Lady Athena, Potnia of the city. And they name Diwo Nuso, Dionysus, a god long believed by scholars to have arrived late in Greek religion, imported from Thrace or Phrygia, yet here inscribed on tablets from the 13th century before the Common Era, fully present in the Bronze Age pantheon. At Pylos, the tablets reveal something further. Poseidon receives the largest recorded offerings: grain, honey, oil, livestock. He appears to hold primacy in Messenian worship, outranking Zeus in the local hierarchy. The divine landscape is not yet the Olympian order that classical Greece will codify. It is older, more fluid, shaped by regional variation and palace authority. Offerings follow precise bureaucratic protocols. Tablets list quantities of barley, figs, wine, honey, flour, and olive oil allocated to specific deities and their sanctuaries. The palace does not merely tolerate religion, it administers it. Priests and priestesses hold designated land allotments recorded in the same tablets that track sheep and bronze. The sacred economy is inseparable from the secular one. The continuity is staggering. The gods who receive offerings in these fire-baked tablets, Poseidon, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Ares, Dionysus, Hermes recorded as Emea too, will survive the coming catastrophe. They will endure centuries of silence, carried forward in oral tradition, in ritual memory, in the persistence of worship at sites that never fully cease to be sacred. When classical Greeks pour libations and speak divine names, they echo syllables first pressed into wet clay in palace archive rooms, where scribes tallied the god's share of the harvest alongside the king's share of the wool. But the gods do not dwell only in the syllables of their names or the inventories of their offerings. They live in the body's motion, in the charged space between a leaping figure and the horns of a charging bull, in the double axe gleaming on a pillar, in the labyrinthine corridors that fold inward upon themselves like a prayer made architectural. The central court of Knossos stretches roughly 52 meters long and 28 meters wide, its paving stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. Along its western edge, tiers of shallow steps rise in what appears to be a viewing area, oriented toward the open court where ritual performance unfolds. The bull leaper fresco, recovered from the east wing of the palace, captures the act in frozen perfection. A massive bull charges forward, its body elongated in full gallop. One figure grasps the horns, a second arches in mid-somersault over the animal's back. A third stands behind with arms extended, ready to receive the vaulter. The figures are painted in the Minoan convention, reddish-brown skin for one, white for another, and their bodies are lithe, muscular, impossibly poised between danger and grace. This is not decoration. This image appears on seal stones, on ivory figurines, on bronze statuettes found across Crete and beyond. The consistency across media and centuries suggests an actual practiced ritual, performed repeatedly within the palace precinct during the Neopalatial period. The double axe presides over these spaces. Carved into stone blocks along palace corridors, cast in bronze in miniature and monumental form, incised on pillars in basement rooms where libation vessels cluster at their base, the labrys is the most pervasive sacred symbol of Minoan Crete. The very word labyrinth likely derives from it, the house of the double axe. Knossos earns this name honestly. Its corridors turn and branch across multiple levels, connecting over 13,000 square meters of rooms, stairways, light wells, and storage magazines in a plan so intricate that any visitor unfamiliar with its logic might wander endlessly. Later Greek memory transforms this architectural reality into myth. The labyrinth of Daedalus, the prison of the Minotaur, the half-bull creature fed on Athenian youth until Theseus navigates the maze with Ariadne's thread. Horns of consecration crown the roof lines. These stylized bull horns, carved from stone or molded in plaster, mark the sacred character of the buildings they adorn. They appear at Knossos, at Phaistos, at the small palace of Hagia Triada nestled in the western Messara. At Hagia Triada, a carved stone vessel known as the Harvester Vase depicts a procession of men carrying winnowing forks, their mouths open in song, led by a figure shaking a sistrum. The energy is communal, rhythmic, ecstatic. On the same site, the Boxer Rhyton shows helmeted fighters in combat, their gloves laced tight, blood perhaps implied in the intensity of their stance. The limestone sarcophagus from Hagia Triada, dating to around 1400 before the Common Era, provides the most complete picture of Minoan funerary ritual. On one long side, a trussed bull lies on a table, its blood draining into a vessel below, while a woman makes offerings at an altar crowned with horns of consecration and a double axe on which a bird perches. On the opposite side, figures carry offerings, a boat model, animal skins, toward a figure standing before a tomb. A lyre player accompanies the procession. Bull sacrifice, libation, music, and offering converge in a single ceremonial sequence, linking the living to the dead, the human to the divine. These rituals are not peripheral to Minoan civilization. They are its spiritual architecture, as carefully constructed as the gypsum corridors and the tapered columns. The bull is not merely an animal. It is the embodiment of power channeled through human daring. The labyrinth is not merely a building. It is a cosmology rendered in stone, a sacred geography where every turning corridor leads deeper into the presence of forces that demand courage, precision, and reverence. When these palaces fall and their rituals cease, the memory does not vanish. It transforms. It becomes the story of a monster in a maze, of a hero with a thread, of a civilization so strange and magnificent that only myth could contain it. Beyond the palace walls, beyond the painted megara and the archive rooms where scribes press reed styluses into wet clay, another world exists. It is a world the tablets record but never celebrate, a world of hands that never hold gold, of lives measured not in glory but in grain rations and lengths of woven cloth. On the hillsides below the citadel of Pylos, small settlements cluster along unpaved paths. The houses are modest, rubble walls plastered with mud, roofs of timber and thatch, floors of packed earth worn smooth by generations of bare feet. A single room serves for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Clay hearths blacken the walls with soot. Coarse domestic pottery sits on low benches, cooking vessels, storage jars, simple drinking cups lacking the refinement of palatial kylikes. This is where the majority of the Mycenaean population lives, far from the painted octopus floors and the perfumed oil workshops. The Linear B tablets at Pylos name them. Groups of women appear in the records, identified by their place of origin. Women from Miletus, from Cnidos, from Lemnos, from Chios. They are textile workers, assigned to spinning and weaving in palace-controlled workshops. The tablets count them alongside their children, listing rations of wheat and figs allocated for their sustenance. The term doeira appears beside many of their names. It is the ancestor of the classical Greek word doule. It means slave. These women card raw wool, spin thread on clay spindle whirls, and weave on upright, warp-weighted looms. Hundreds of loom weights recovered from palace workshops and domestic sites testify to the scale of textile production. The tablets record the output with the same precision applied to chariot wheels and bronze ingots. So many units of cloth, so many workers, so many children fed. The children themselves appear as dependents, their futures already inscribed in the administrative system that sustains and confines them. Beyond the workshops, the agricultural labourers tend terraced fields of wheat and barley. Their skeletal remains, recovered from modest chamber tombs cut into soft limestone hillsides, tell stories the tablets never record. Bones show evidence of osteoarthritis in spines and joints, the signature of repetitive heavy labour begun in youth. Dental analysis reveals heavy wear and frequent caries consistent with diets dominated by coarsely ground grain. Enamel hypoplasia, lines of disrupted growth on tooth surfaces, indicates episodes of childhood malnutrition or disease. Average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 35 years. The tombs themselves are simple. A short dromos leads to a small rock-cut chamber where multiple burials accumulate over generations. Grave goods are few: a plain stirrup jar, a bronze knife, a few beads of glass paste rather than the carnelian and lapis lazuli of elite burials. Occasionally a clay figurine of the PC or Phi type, a small female form with upraised or folded arms, accompanies the dead, suggesting that even the humblest sought divine protection in the afterlife. Frescoes from Thebes and Tiryns depict women in elaborate dress, flounced skirts, open bodices, elaborate hairstyles. These images represent elite women, priestesses, and court attendants. The women of the tablets, The Duira from Anatolian and Aegean towns wear no such finery. Their world is thread and loom, ration and labor, the rhythm of seasons measured in allocated figs. Yet they are not invisible. The administrative system that exploits them also preserves them. Every tablet that records a woman's origin, a child's ration, a worker's output is an inadvertent act of remembrance. When the palaces burn and the tablets bake hard in the flames, these names and numbers survive. They become the only voices of ordinary Mycenaean life to reach across 3,000 years. Not the voices of kings or warriors, but of spinners, weavers, mothers, and children whose labor sustained the civilization, whose golden masks and lion gates would one day astonish the world. Something changes in the air around 1250 years before the Common Era. It is not visible in the frescoes or the gold. It is visible in stone. At Mycenae, masons extend the fortification walls westward, enclosing the grave circle that once stood outside the citadel. The old burial ground of ancestors, previously honored in open ground, now falls within the defensive perimeter. The message is unmistakable. What was once safely outside must now be protected within. At Tiryns the walls grow thicker still, their cyclopean bulk reaching 7.5 meters in places. New galleries are carved within the masonry itself, corbelled tunnels that can serve as storage or shelter. But the most telling construction lies beneath Mycenae's northeastern wall. A secret passage descends through 99 steps, plunging 18 meters underground to reach a subterranean cistern fed by a natural spring. The engineering is extraordinary, a corbelled tunnel burrowing through bedrock to guarantee water during siege. No civilization builds such a passage in confidence. This is the architecture of fear. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the same tremor runs through every palace and port. The Hittite Empire, which has governed Anatolia for centuries and corresponded with Mycenaean kings as equals, begins to fracture. Grain shipments from Egypt to the Hittite capital at Hattusa suggest famine. The vassal states along the Syrian coast strain under pressure from unknown raiders arriving by sea. At Ugarit, on the Levantine coast, the evidence is heartbreaking in its specificity. Clay tablets record desperate correspondence. The king of Ugarit writes that enemy ships have been sighted. His own fleet is deployed elsewhere. His army is stationed in Hittite territory. The city stands exposed. Around 1185 years before the Common Era, Ugarit burns. It is never rebuilt. The tablets, like those at Pylos, survive only because fire bakes the clay that was meant to be temporary. The forces behind these destructions bear a name given by Egyptian scribes, the Sea Peoples. At Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Rameses III near Thebes, massive stone reliefs depict a naval battle fought around 1178 years before the Common Era. The carvings show enemy warriors in horned helmets and feathered headdresses fighting from ships with high prows. Ox carts carry women and children. These are not mere raiders but migrating populations. The inscriptions name them the Peleset, the Tcheka, the Shekelesh, the Denien, the Weshesh. Egypt repels them, but the victory is Pyrrhic. The old international order is already dying. The identity of the Sea Peoples remains debated. Some may be displaced Mycenaean Greeks themselves, driven from their homes by the same instabilities they inflict on others. The Peleset likely become the Philistines of the Levantine coast. The Shekelesh may connect to Sicily. What matters is not a single origin, but a cascading system failure. trade networks that once linked the Baltic to the Nile through dozens of intermediary ports begin to unravel. Tin from Afghanistan and Cornwall, copper from Cyprus, gold from Nubia, ivory from Syria. These flows depended on stable political structures at every node. When one collapses, the stress transfers to the next. The Hittite capital of Hattusa burns around 1180 years before the Common Era. Its archives fall silent. Cyprus, the great copper island, suffers destructions at Enkomi and Kition. The palace at Thebes on the Greek mainland shows signs of destruction in this same turbulent generation. The interconnected world that allowed Mycenaean stirrup jars to reach Ugarit and Canaanite glass to reach Tyrins is tearing apart at every seam. Inside the citadels of the Argolid, the walls hold. The cisterns fill. The granaries store what harvest the dry seasons allow. But the system that gave these fortresses their purpose, the palatial economy of redistribution, the international trade in prestige goods, the diplomatic web of great kings addressing one another as brothers, is dissolving around them. The walls of Mycenae still stand massive against the Argive plain. The Lion Gate still guards the entrance. But what approaches now is something that Cyclopean masonry cannot stop. The fire comes to Pylos first. Around 1180 years before the Common Era, flames sweep through the Palace of Nestor on its hilltop, above the bay of Navarino. The conflagration is total. Painted plaster cracks and falls from the walls of the Megaron, the great central hearth splitting under temperatures that warp bronze and shatter stone. Roof timbers collapse inward, burying the octopus-painted floor under charred debris. In the pantries, thousands of clay drinking cups, kylikes stacked in neat rows by servants who expected to use them again, lie crushed beneath fallen masonry. But in one small room near the entrance, something extraordinary happens. The archive chamber, where scribes stored their administrative tablets of unbaked clay, catches fire with such intensity that the clay hardens permanently. Over 1,000 Linear B tablets, never meant to survive beyond the current accounting season, are baked into permanence by the very catastrophe that destroys the world they recorded. Inventories of bronze allocated to smiths, lists of rowers summoned for coastal defense, offerings designated for Poseidon, all frozen in the moment of collapse. These tablets become the voice of a civilization speaking from its own funeral pyre. No rebuilding follows. The hilltop stands empty. Rain washes through roofless corridors. Weeds push through the painted floors. The entire administrative apparatus of Messenia, the Wanax and his officials, the tax collectors and the textile supervisors, the network that tracked 100,000 sheep, ceases to exist within a single generation. On the Argive plain, the destruction unfolds in waves rather than a single blow. Mycenae endures longer than Pylos, but evidence in the archaeological record tells of repeated crises between roughly 1200 and 1130 years before the Common Era. Fire-blackened walls appear in the lower town. Houses outside the citadel are abandoned. The population contracts behind the Cyclopean fortifications, clinging to the hilltop as the surrounding settlements empty. At some point, the granary inside the walls burns, and with it any capacity to sustain a concentrated population through siege or famine. Tyrins suffers earthquake damage so severe that sections of its massive walls, 7.5 meters thick, built to withstand any human assault, buckle and collapse. The corbelled galleries crack. Yet people continue to inhabit the ruins for a time, building modest structures within the shattered fortress, a diminished community sheltering inside the skeleton of a palace that once hosted feasting halls and painted corridors. Medea, the smaller citadel between Mycenae and Tiryns, burns around 1200 before the Common Era. Its destruction layer contains fallen mud brick, carbonized wood, and pottery crushed in place. At Thebes in Boeotia, the Cadmeion, the palatial complex at the heart of the city, shows evidence of violent destruction in this same era, its frescoed walls collapsing into rubble. No single explanation accounts for every site. Some destructions bear the signature of earthquake. Walls sheared along fault lines, foundations displaced. Others show deliberate burning, fires set in multiple locations simultaneously, a pattern inconsistent with accidental conflagration. Some scholars point to internal revolt, subject populations rising against the palatial elite that had controlled their labor and their grain. Others emphasize the cascading failure of interconnected systems. When trade with the eastern Mediterranean ceased, the bronze supply vanished, and without bronze the military and economic machinery of the palaces could not function. What the evidence makes clear is that the palatial system does not merely weaken. It ends. The institution of the wanax disappears. Linear B writing, dependent entirely on palace administration, vanishes with the scribes who practiced it. The centralized redistribution of goods, the organized craft production, the diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers, all of it collapses within decades. At Mycenae, the population drops by approximately 75% within a single generation. The citadel that once commanded the Argolid becomes a village among ruins, its lion gate still standing but guarding nothing except memory and ash. The silence that follows is not sudden. It descends like a long winter, settling over the Aegean world in layers across decades, then generations. By 1100 years before the Common Era, the great citadels stand largely empty. Weeds push through the painted plaster of fallen Megara. Rain pools in the corbelled galleries of Tiryns. The administrative machinery that once counted every sheep and every jar of oil has ceased entirely, and with it the script that recorded such things. Linear B vanishes from the earth. No one writes in the Aegean world for approximately 400 years. The population collapses. In some regions of the Peloponnese and Boeotia, settlement density drops by as much as 75 to 90%. Entire districts that once supported dozens of villages return to scrub and silence. The Argolid, which sustained the great centers of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Medea, becomes a landscape of scattered hamlets. Messenia, where the Palace of Nestor once administered tens of thousands of workers, is nearly abandoned. Yet life does not end. It contracts, simplifies, and endures. At Athens, occupation continues without interruption on the Acropolis and its slopes. The settlement is modest, its architecture humble, but the thread of habitation never breaks. At Knossos on Crete, people still live among the ruins of the great palace, burying their dead in chamber tombs that echo older customs. These are not thriving centers. They are embers. The pottery tells the story of this diminished world with painful clarity. Sub-Mycenaean ware, produced in the decades after the collapse, retains the shapes of Mycenaean vessels but loses their precision. The painted decoration becomes sparse, careless, reduced to wavy lines and simple bands. The clay is coarser. The firing is uneven. It is the work of communities that remember the forms of the past, but lack the specialized workshops and trained artisans to reproduce them. Then, slowly, something shifts. By around 1050 before the Common Era, a new ceramic style emerges, proto-geometric pottery. Its hallmark is discipline. Circles and semicircles drawn with a compass and multiple brush replace the freehand wavering of sub-Mycenaean work. The surfaces are cleaner, the forms tighter. Athens appears to lead this development, and the style spreads outward across the Aegean. It is a small revolution, but it signals that craft traditions are reorganizing, that aesthetic ambition is returning. Iron replaces bronze, not because iron is superior in this early period, the first iron blades are often softer than good bronze, but because the tin trade networks that made bronze possible have collapsed. Iron ore, by contrast, is locally available across Greece. Smiths learn to work it, and gradually iron tools and weapons become standard. The transition reshapes daily life at the most fundamental level. At Lefkandi on the island of Euboea, around 1,000 years before the Common Era, a burial challenges every assumption about the poverty of this age. Inside a massive apsidal building stretching nearly 50 meters in length, archaeologists discover the cremated remains of a warrior placed in a bronze amphora from Cyprus, alongside iron weapons, gold jewelry, and an elaborate necklace of gold and faience beads. Beside him lies a woman adorned with gold rings and an iron knife. 2 horses are buried in an adjacent pit. The building itself is deliberately collapsed over the graves, creating a monument. This is not the work of a destitute society. Someone at Lefkandi commands wealth, maintains overseas contacts, and receives honors that recall the heroic burials of the Mycenaean age. Trade, then, does not vanish completely. It contracts to a trickle, but Euboean communities maintain fragile links with Cyprus and the Levant. Through these slender channels, goods and ideas continue to move. Migration reshapes the Greek world during these centuries. Populations cross the Aegean to settle the coast of Anatolia, Aeolians in the north, Ionians in the center, Dorians in the south. These migrations carried dialects, customs, and memories eastward. The oral traditions that preserve the stories of Troy, of Mycenae, of great kings and fallen cities travel with them. Bards recite tales of a world they have never seen but refuse to forget. The language evolves, the details blur and magnify, but the core narratives survive, passed from mouth to mouth across the darkness. Somewhere in this silence, the seeds of Homer take root. The seeds take root slowly, in darkness, in soil that remembers what the surface has forgotten. By 900 years before the Common Era, the Aegean world begins to stir. It is not a dramatic awakening. It is the faintest quickening, a potter's hand growing steadier, a settlement expanding by a few houses, a trade route reopening after generations of silence. The long winter is not over, but somewhere beneath the frost, something green is pushing upward. The pottery tells the story first. In Athens, in Argos, in Lefkandi, vessels emerge bearing a new visual language. Gone are the fluid octopuses and marine forms of the Bronze Age. In their place, tight geometric patterns cover every surface. Concentric circles drawn with a compass, meanders, zigzags, cross-hatched triangles, and checkerboard bands arranged with mathematical precision. This is the proto-geometric style evolving into the mature geometric, and it represents not poverty of imagination, but a new aesthetic discipline, an ordering of the world through abstraction. By the mid-8th century before the Common Era, human figures returned to pottery for the first time in centuries. On the monumental Dipolon amphora from Athens, standing over 1.5 meters tall, stick-like mourners raise their arms in grief around a body lying on a bier. Chariots process. Warriors carry figure-8 shields that echo Mycenaean forms. The dead are being honored again with public spectacle, and the images, however stylized, carry the unmistakable weight of ritual memory. Communities coalesce. Scattered hamlets draw together into larger settlements that begin to define shared territories, shared sanctuaries, shared identities. The polis, the city-state, does not appear fully formed, but its foundations are laid in these decades. At Olympia in the western Peloponnese, a sanctuary sacred to Zeus attracts visitors from across the Greek-speaking world. By tradition, the first Olympic Games are held in 776 years before the Common Era, and whether or not that precise date is historical, the gathering represents something profound, a shared cultural identity emerging from fragmentation. Then comes the transformation that changes everything. Sometime around 800 before the Common Era, Greek traders in contact with Phoenician merchants along the Levantine coast encounter the Phoenician consonantal alphabet. They adapt it with a stroke of genius, assigning unused Phoenician letters to vowel sounds, creating the first fully phonetic alphabet in human history. Writing returns to the Aegean after 4 centuries of silence, but it returns in a radically different form, no longer the specialized tool of palace scribes recording sheep and chariot wheels, but a flexible system accessible to merchants, poets, and ordinary citizens. Early inscriptions appear scratched on pottery, ownership marks, dedications, even playful boasts. And it is into this newly literate world that the great epics crystallize. Somewhere in Ionia, along the Anatolian coast where migrants carried their ancestors' stories, a poet tradition reaches its supreme expression. The Iliad and the Odyssey, attributed to Homer and composed around 750 to 700 before the Common Era, gather centuries of oral memory into monumental verse. The poems remember Bronze Age realities, boar's tusk helmets no longer made for centuries, the great walls of Tiryns, the catalogue of ships from ports long abandoned. The word anax, descended from the Mycenaean wanax inscribed on Linear B tablets, still names the kings of the epic world. Homer does not know he is preserving archaeology. He is telling stories. But within those stories, the Bronze Age breathes. Early temples rise at Samos, at Thermon, at Eretria, long rectangular structures with a porch, a central hall, a rear chamber. Their plan echoes the Mycenaean megaron with striking fidelity. The column, the axial approach, the sacred interior space. These architectural ideas have survived the darkness not in stone, but in practice, in the way communities build their houses for the gods. A thread runs unbroken from the painted hearthroom at Pylos to the first stone temples of archaic Greece. The civilization that burned has not vanished. It has transformed, scattered its essence into language, into myth, into the very shape of sacred architecture. And now, in the gathering light of the 8th century, it begins to reassemble into something the world will call Greece. For more than 2,000 years, the palaces sleep beneath the earth. Olive trees root through painted plaster. Shepherds graze their flocks over buried throne rooms. The stories survive only as myth, a golden king, a labyrinth, a monster, and the scholars of Europe dismiss them as fantasy. Then, in the 19th century, a German businessman who made his fortune in indigo dye and military provisions turns his obsessive attention to Homer and decides the legends are true. Heinrich Schliemann arrives at the citadel of Mycenae in August of 1876. The Lion Gate still stands, its massive relief visible above the accumulated debris of millennia. Schliemann has already excavated at Troy, already scandalized the academic world with his methods and his claims. Now he digs inside the circuit wall, just south of the gate, where the ancient traveler Pausanias once noted the tombs of Agamemnon and his companions. The earth yields its secrets with astonishing speed. Shaft graves open one after another, 6 in total, containing 19 burials laden with gold. Death masks hammered from sheet gold cover the faces of the dead. Diadems, signet rings, inlaid daggers, rock crystal bowls, and hundreds of gold discs emerge from the soil. One mask, with its closed eyes and serene expression, strikes Schliemann with such force that he sends a telegram declaring he has gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. The mask predates any possible Trojan War by 3 centuries, but the emotional power of the moment reshapes European consciousness. The Bronze Age Aegean is no longer myth. It is material, tangible, golden. 24 years later, on the 23rd of March, 1900, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans begins excavating a low mound called Kephala on the outskirts of Heraklion in Crete. He has purchased the site after years of studying tiny carved seal stones sold in Athenian antiquities shops, stones bearing symbols in an unknown script. Within weeks, the scale of what lies beneath becomes clear. Walls emerge, gypsum-paved corridors, grand staircases, light wells, storage magazines lined with enormous clay jars. Frescoes appear, dolphins leaping through blue water, women in elaborate flounced skirts, a figure vaulting over the back of a charging bull. Evans names this civilization Minoan, after the legendary King Minos. His restorations, reinforced concrete columns painted deep red, reconstructed frescoes, rebuilt upper stories, prove controversial. They impose interpretation onto evidence, yet they also give the world its first tangible image of a civilization that predates classical Greece by more than a millennium. The palaces yield thousands of clay tablets inscribed in 2 scripts Evans designates Linear A and Linear B. Linear A remains undeciphered. Linear B resists all attempts at reading for half a century. Then, in 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris, who has been obsessed with the problem since attending a lecture by Evans at age 14, constructs a systematic grid of syllabic values. Working with linguist John Chadwick, he tests a radical hypothesis that the language behind Linear B is not some unknown tongue, but an early form of Greek. On the 1st of July 1952, Ventris announces his decipherment on a BBC radio broadcast. The tablets speak. They record offerings to Poseidon, inventories of chariots, lists of bronze smiths, allocations of grain. The names of gods emerge from 3,000-year-old clay: Zeus, Hera, Athena, Dionysus, proving that Mycenaean religion flows directly into classical Greek worship. The decipherment transforms everything. The Mycenaeans are no longer a mysterious pre-Greek people. They are Greek. Their language is the ancestor of the language of Plato and Sophocles. The thread that runs from the Bronze Age palaces through the dark centuries into the classical world is not metaphorical. It is linguistic, religious, administrative, and real. The civilizations that archaeology has pulled from the earth are not predecessors standing outside Greek history. They are its deepest foundation. The thread is linguistic, and it is unbroken. The syllables scratched into clay at Pylos and Knossos, Posedao, Diwo, Atana, Potinija, do not vanish when the palaces burn. They pass through the mouths of generations who cannot write, carried in hymns and prayers across 4 centuries of darkness, until they emerge again in the sanctuaries of archaic Greece as Poseidon, Zeus, Athena. Every major deity worshipped on the Acropolis of Athens, at the great altar of Olympia, in the temples of the Peloponnese, already receives offerings in the Bronze Age. Every god except Apollo and Aphrodite appears on Linear B tablets. The religion of classical Greece is not an invention of the first millennium. It is an inheritance from the second. The architecture carries the same memory. The Mycenaean megaron, a rectangular hall with a columned porch, a vestibule, and a central hearth flanked by 4 pillars, becomes the template for the Greek temple. The Parthenon itself, that supreme expression of classical order, echoes a spatial logic, first realized in the painted halls of Pylos and Tiryns. The Doric column, tapering upward with its simple capital, may descend from Minoan prototypes that taper downward, inverted and transformed across centuries, but retaining the fundamental principle of the load-bearing stone pillar as architectural expression. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its relieving triangle and heraldic sculpture, anticipates the monumental gateways of classical citadels. Language tells the deepest story. The Greek that Plato writes in the 4th century before the Common Era descends directly from the Greek recorded in Linear B 700 years earlier. The word wonax, meaning king in Mycenaean palatial administration, survives in Homer as Anax, the title given to Agamemnon. The word kasireu, a minor official in Bronze Age records, rises through the Dark Ages to become basileus, the classical Greek word for king. The vocabulary of power itself reshapes as society transforms, but the linguistic roots hold firm. The maritime identity of Greece begins on Crete. Minoan ships crossing to Egypt, to Ugarit, to the Cyclades, establish the pattern of seaborne commerce and cultural exchange that defines Greek civilization for millennia. The Mycenaeans inherit this orientation and extend it, their stirrup jars reaching Italy, their pottery traded from the Levant to Sardinia. When Greek colonists of the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era sail to found cities across the Mediterranean, they follow routes first charted by Bronze Age keels. The mythological imagination preserves what history forgets. Theseus entering the labyrinth remembers the vast, disorienting corridors of Knossos. Agamemnon ruling from golden Mycenae remembers the shaft graves and their treasure. The Trojan War, whatever its historical kernel, remembers a world of chariot warriors, boars' tusk helmets, and palace kings commanding fleets, details accurate to the late Bronze Age and preserved through oral tradition across the illiterate centuries. Homer does not invent this world. He inherits it. The Minoans and Mycenaeans are not civilizations that precede Greece and then disappear. They are the first expression of something continuous. Their gods become the Olympians. Their language becomes the language of philosophy, tragedy, and democracy. Their columns hold up temples that still stand. Their myths shape Western literature to this day. The story that begins with Neolithic farmers crossing to Crete around 7,000 years before the Common Era does not end when the palaces burn. It transforms, endures, and builds the civilization that builds the Western world. These are not lost cultures recovered by archaeology. They are the foundation upon which everything that follows is constructed, stone by stone, word by word, God by God. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete story of the Minoans and Mycenaeans. If these ancient worlds have stirred your curiosity, consider subscribing so you never miss a new exploration into the civilizations that shaped our own.